23 children were determined locked inside the basement of a Georgia plantation in 1864, all bearing the equal distinctive features: high cheekbones, light inexperienced eyes, and auburn hair streaked with gold. Whilst Union infantrymen forced open the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, they located these youngsters huddled together in darkness, a few as young as 4, others drawing close early life. The eldest, a girl of 13, instructed the officials something that made veteran infantrymen bodily unwell. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we're her blood." Army records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry point out the incident most effective, as soon as in a letter marked private and buried in regimental information for over a century. Local histories of Burke County leave out Thornhill property completely, as though the plantation and its mistress in no way existed. However, they did exist. And what Catherine Thornhill created in those 16 years, between her husband's demise and the advent of federal troops, represents one of the maximum annoying chapters in American history. A systematic breeding application designed to create generations of enslaved folks who may want to in no way get away their bondage due to the fact they had been genetically tied to their owner. Earlier than we keep with the tale of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she constructed in rural Georgia, I want you to do something. In case you're listening to this tale and it's making your pores and skin crawl, hit that subscribe button proper now. This channel dives deep into the darkest corners of American records, the memories they don't train in schools, the secrets and techniques buried in courthouse basement and forgotten army information. And that I want to understand wherein you're listening from. Drop a remark telling me what state or city you're in. Are you near Burke County, Georgia? Does your town have secrets like this buried in its past? Let's find out together. Now let's cross lower back to where all of it started. To a chilly February morning in 1847, while a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that could hang out Georgia for generations. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband turned into the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. The Thornhill property sat on 1,700 acres of pink clay soil, 7 miles southwest of Wisboro, the county seat. In 1847, Burke County was cotton country, though now not as rich because the Black Belt areas similarly west. The soil here turned into worn-out, overworked via many years of single-crop farming. Plantations that had flourished within the 1820s have been struggling by using the 1840s, squeezed among falling cotton fees and rising charges. The Mexican War had drawn away people, and speak of territorial expansion divided groups alongside bitter lines. Thornhill property had once been most of the greater successful homes within the vicinity. Catherine's late husband, Jonathan Thornhill, had inherited it from his father in 1838, with 42 enslaved people, okay equipment, and workable debt. But Jonathan had been a poor manager and an enthusiastic gambler. By the time a winter fever claimed him in February 1847, the estate became mortgaged to the hilt. The fields have been generating barely sufficient to feed the workers, and creditors were circling like buzzards. Catherine became 28, while she had become a widow. She had married Jonathan while she became 19, a strategic match organized by means of her father, Theodore Danforth, a distinguished merchant in Augusta. The Danforths had been antique Georgia money, descended from settlers who had arrived inside the 1730s. Catherine were educated by private tutors, spoke French passably well, and had been raised with expectations of handling a significant family. What she had now not predicted was to inherit a failing plantation with crushing debts and a 16-year-old son who looked at her with something drawing close hatred. Richard Thornhill was Jonathan's son from his first marriage. His mother had died giving start to him in 1831, and Jonathan had remarried 5 years later. Richard had never warmed to Catherine, viewing her as an intruder who had changed his real mom. He was a sullen, bookish boy who spent most of his time within the property's small library, avoiding both his stepmother and the practical paintings of going for walks at Plantation. Catherine located him susceptible, impractical, and entirely too sentimental about the enslaved workers. He had once counseled they have to learn to study, and concepts so dangerous that Catherine had forbidden him from speaking of it again. The plantation itself contemplated its declining fortunes. The main residence turned into a story structure of whitewashed brick, with 6 columns across the the front portico, built in 1805, inside the federal style. Paint peeled from the window frames, and the roof leaked in 3 places. The furnishings inside turned into a mixture of inherited pieces from Jonathan's family and less expensive replacements bought whilst the coolest pieces had been bought to pay gambling debts. Behind the principal house stood the kitchen building, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the overseer's cottage, all in similar states of disrepair. Further lower back, past a line of live oak draped with Spanish moss, were the quarters where the enslaved populace lived. In 1847, 31 people remained at the assets, 11 guys, 13 girls, and 7 youngsters. 16 others had been offered off over the preceding 3 years to satisfy Jonathan's lenders. People who remained knew that more sales had been coming. Fear hung over the quarters like fog over the Savannah River. Catherine spent the primary month after Jonathan's demise in a form of controlled fury. She met with the estate's attorney, Ambrose Talbot, who laid out her alternatives in blunt terms. Promote the assets and the closing workers to settle the money owed and possibly have enough left over to live modestly in Augusta under her father's roof, or locate a few ways to make the plantation profitable again, which Talbot considered not likely, given the state of the cotton marketplace and the estate's depleted assets. Neither option became proper to Catherine. Returning to Augusta would mean admitting failure, dwelling as a structured spinster in her father's residence, for all time marked as the widow who couldn't keep on to her inheritance. However, she also identified that conventional plantation control wouldn't shop Thornhill estate. The land was worn out, the device was old. The remaining enslaved people have been inadequate in variety to work the cotton fields profitably, and she or he had no money to purchase extra. It was throughout this sort of sleepless nights, poring over the estate's account books through candlelight, that Catherine conceived her plan. The idea got here to her with the cold good judgment of desperation. If she could not have enough money to purchase employees, she would breed them, but no longer in the haphazard manner most plantations did it, providing minor incentives for couples to have youngsters and ready 15 years for those kids to turn out to be productive laborers. No, Catherine estimated something some distance extra systematic, more managed. She would create a population of people who had been biologically tied to the estate, who may want to by no means be bought due to the fact they were her personal descendants, who could have an instinctive loyalty to the plantation as it become actually in their blood. The plan turned into significant. However, to Catherine, it turned into additionally stylish. She became nevertheless younger sufficient to endure youngsters. She would pick out the strongest, healthiest guys, the various enslaved population, and conceive kids with them. These youngsters would be raised understanding their parentage, could take delivery of slightly higher treatment than the others to make sure their loyalty, and once they reached adulthood, would be paired with enslaved girls to supply the subsequent era. Inside 20 years, Catherine calculated she ought to have a staff of 50 or greater, all bound to Thornhill estate by using ties that went deeper than prison ownership. She started maintaining a journal to exercise session the information. This changed into no diary of personal emotions. Catherine was far too realistic for that. As a substitute, she created what she referred to as her cultivation information, filled with calculations, observations, and plans. She wrote in an easy substitution cipher, changing key phrases with risk-free agricultural terms. Kids have become seedlings. The men she selected became rootuck. Pregnancies were plantings. The magazine's pages were blanketed with diagrams that gave the impression of breeding charts for cattle, because that turned into basically what they were. Catherine's first choice changed into a person named Isaac, 24 years old, born on the plantation, and recognized for his physical electricity and regular temperament. She summoned him to the primary house on a March evening in 1847, after the other workers had retired to the quarters. What took place that night was recorded in Catherine's journal only as first planting finished with rootstock 1, weather clear and slight. 3 weeks later, she summoned him again, and then 2 times extra earlier than the month ended. Via April, Catherine became assured she turned into pregnant. She recorded this in her journal with the equal emotional detachment she might be aware the planting of cotton. Preliminary cultivation successful. Assume harvest in December. Richard Thornhill first suspected something became wrong with his stepmother in past due May additionally of 1847. He noticed she had stopped taking her morning rides across the property, claiming the heat afflicted her, despite the fact that the Georgia summer season had barely all started. She took her food in her room greater frequently, and had disregarded the resident servant who usually attended her, who preferred to manipulate her very own affairs. For a girl as worried with appearances as Catherine, this withdrawal became uncommon. However, it changed into a conversation Richard overheard in early June that clearly alarmed him. He were in the library, hidden at the back of one of the tall bookcases, whilst Catherine met with Miriam Grayson inside the adjoining parlour. Mrs. Grayson became the nearby midwife, a sharp-featured female of 50 who attended births for both white and enslaved households at some point of Burke County. Richard knew her slightly. She had a recognition as a skilled practitioner, but also as someone who asked few questions and stored confidences. "Truly, you are certain of your situation?" Mrs. Grayson asked in her clipped expert tone. "Pretty positive," Catherine answered. "I must think sometime in early December. And Mr. Thornhill exceeded in February, you stated." There was a pause. Richard pressed himself in opposition to the bookcase, hardly breathing. "My past-due husband and I have been intimate in January," Catherine said frivolously, rapidly earlier than his very last contamination. En route, Mrs. Grayson's voice carried a notice of something, no longer pretty disbelief, however a careful neutrality. "I'll need to look at you nicely, and we should speak the preparations for the shipping. Will you want me here at the house?" "I will, and I'll want your discretion, Miriam." "Surely. You've got it, as usually." Richard waited until each ladies had left the room before emerging from his hiding place. His fingers had been shaking. The arithmetic didn't work. His father had been bedridden for the whole month of January, barely aware maximum days, racked with fever and chills. Richard had sat with him many nights. There were no possibility of intimate family members among his father and Catherine, which intended the kid Catherine turned into carrying were conceived after Jonathan's demise in March or April with someone else. The implications made Richard sick to his stomach. If word were given out that Catherine had conceived a baby out of wedlock, the scandal could destroy what little remained of the own family's recognition. Lenders could move right away to capture the assets. The Danforth family in Augusta might disown her. However, past the realistic results, Richard became appalled by the deception itself. Catherine meant to claim this toddler as his father's valid inheritor, to lie to each person, to build her future on a foundation of fraud. He considered his alternatives. He should confront Catherine at once, but he turned into handiest 16, and he or she held all prison authority over the property. He could go to lawyer Talbot in Westborough, but without proof, it would be his phrase against Catherine's, and as a minor his testimony could convey little weight. He could write to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta. However, Catherine examined all outgoing mail from the estate. As an alternative, Richard began to watch Catherine cautiously, looking for evidence, looking to apprehend what she become planning. He noticed that she summoned Isaac to the primary house often, continually after dark, constantly while the overseer turned into away on the town or excited about obligations elsewhere at the assets. He saw how Catherine's way towards Isaac changed into distinct from her remedy of different enslaved workers, now not typed precisely, however less openly adversarial. She spoke to him in complete sentences rather than curt commands. Through July, Richard becomes certain Isaac turned into the father of Catherine's infant. The belief stuffed him with horror, not simply at the violation of social and legal boundaries, but at what it revealed about Catherine's individual. She had coldly, deliberately chosen to conceive her infant with an enslaved man, to say that toddler as her late husband's, and to keep this lie indefinitely. What form of woman was able to such calculated deception? He found a part of the answer in early August, in the course of one in every of Catherine's rare journeys to Westborough. Richard had been searching for legal files associated with the estate. He had indistinct thoughts of locating something that would provide him leverage over Catherine when he found a leather-bound journal hidden in a locked drawer of Catherine's writing table. The lock becomes simple sufficient for a determined 16-year-old to pick out. The journal turned into written in cipher, but Richard had continually been suitable with puzzles. It took him 3 days, running in mystery every time Catherine turned into out of the house, to crack the simple substitution pattern. What he studied made his blood run cold. Catherine wasn't simply having an affair with Isaac. She was imposing a deliberate breeding program. The journal laid it out in chilling detail. Her plan to conceive multiple kids with decided on enslaved men, to elevate those youngsters as part of the plantation personnel, and eventually to reproduce those children with each other and with different enslaved people, to create an ever-expanding population of people who could be genetically tied to Thornhill Estate and to Catherine herself. There were charts, calculations of expected births over 5-year intervals, notes on which men displayed applicable bodily traits, speculation about whether or not tendencies like electricity, intelligence, and temperament have been heritable. It examined like something from a farm animal's breeder's manual, except the livestock had been humans. Richard copied several pages of the magazine, translating the cipher into plain English, his hands shaking so badly he may want to barely keep the pen. This changed into evidence. This was proof of Catherine's depravity. He should take this to the authorities. He could expose her. But that nighttime at dinner, Catherine checked out him with the one's cold, inexperienced eyes and said casually, "Richard, have you ever been in my Take a Look at these days? Some of my papers appear to have been disturbed." "No, ma'am." Richard lied, his throat tight. "I hold certain documents locked away for precise cause," Catherine persevered, reducing her meat with particular strokes. "If I ever found that a person had violated my privacy, damaged my trust in the sort of essential way, I'm afraid I might ought to take severe motion." "Do you apprehend?" "Sure, ma'am, desirable. Because own family loyalty is the whole thing, Richard. The entirety. Without it, we're simply animals tearing at every different—" She smiled, however it failed to reach her eyes. "I recognize you cherished your father very plenty. I would hate for his memory to be tarnished via scandal, particularly scandal that would emerge from within his own household." The risk became clear. If Richard attempted to show Catherine, she could discover a manner to turn it returned on him, to color him as a disturbed, envious stepson, inventing lies about a grieving widow. Who could human beings agree with? A reputable plantation mistress from a distinguished circle of relatives, or an awkward teenage boy, with recognized resentment, closer to his stepmother? Richard again to his room that night and burned the pages he had copied. But he stood watching Catherine, and he began to experience more and more unwell. It started with fatigue. By using September, Richard discovered himself exhausted via mid-afternoon, not able to consciousness on his books. His appetite faded. He evolved frequent complications that made it hard to assume virtually. With the aid of October, he was experiencing muscle weak spot and occasional stomach pains. Catherine confirmed outstanding situation. She insisted Richard live in mattress. She prepared his meals herself, bringing him bowls of soup and plates of gentle ingredients. She summoned Mrs. Grayson to observe him. The midwife, who also served as a standard scientific practitioner in the absence of a right physician, identified worried exhaustion complicated via possible intake. She prescribed rest, fresh air whilst Richard felt robust enough, and a special tonic that Catherine obtained from a pharmacy in Augusta. "Tuberculosis regularly strikes young guys of sensitive disposition," Catherine advised Richard, adjusting his pillows with attentive care. "Your father had a cousin who died of it at simply your age. We should be very vigilant." Richard knew better. He had examined about arsenic poisoning for the duration of his hours in the library. He diagnosed the symptoms in himself: the fatigue, the digestive problems, the muscle weak point. Catherine turned into slowly killing him, disguising homicide as ailment, putting off the only individual who knew her secret and posed a danger to her plans. But he turned into too susceptible to combat, returned, too remoted to get help. The resident servants followed Catherine's orders truly. The overseer rarely came to the main residence. Richard's room changed into on the second one floor, and through November, he slightly had the energy to get off the bed, let alone get away the property and attain Wesborough. He made one very last attempt to expose Catherine in overdue November, writing a letter to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta. It took him 3 days to compose it, running for a couple of minutes at a time before exhaustion crushed him. He described Catherine's breeding program, her journal, the poisoning. He sealed the letter and gave it to one of the younger house servants, a female named Pearl, begging her to submit it in Wesborough without telling Catherine. Pearl took the letter, But she additionally informed Catherine, fearful of what could appear if the mistress found she'd been keeping secrets and techniques. Catherine read the letter expressionless, then burned it within the fire in the front of Richard. "You're very sick, darling," she stated softly, nearly tenderly. "The fever is affecting your mind. You are imagining things that are not real. It is a mercy, actually, which you won't have to suffer a good deal longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3rd, 1847, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. Dr. Samuel Pritchard from Wesborough, summoned to document the demise, noted intake, because the purpose, and remarked that the young man had wasted away with tragic speed. Catherine wept decorously on the funeral. She wore black for a complete voyeur. 4 days after Richard's burial, Catherine gave start to a healthful son. She named him Jonathan after her late husband, and claimed he were born barely premature, which explained any questions about timing. Few humans in Burke County thought to count backwards from the beginning to Catherine's widowhood. Folks who did stored their speculations to themselves. It became now not the sort of thing one discussed brazenly. The years among 1848 and 1856 converted Thornhill Estate in methods that appeared almost magnificent to out-of-doors observers. The plantation that had teetered on the brink of bankruptcy slowly regained its footing. Cotton production increased. The enslaved group of workers grew. Catherine Thornhill earned a reputation as a smart, if relatively reclusive, plantation mistress who managed her property with unusual efficiency. But that efficiency came at a terrible fee that no outsider ever saw. Catherine gave birth 4 greater times between 1848 and 1853. Daughters named Elelena, Abigail and Margaret, and some other son she called Samuel. Each beginning become attended simplest by Miriam Grayson, who by way of now become deeply complicit in Catherine's schemes. The midwife received beneficent payment for her services and her silence, regular costs that a long way past her everyday quotes, plus a small cottage on the edge of the Thornhill belongings, where she could stay without paying lease. Mrs. Grayson's function prolonged a ways past handing over Catherine's youngsters. She additionally achieved a darker characteristic, ensuring that enslaved ladies at the property handiest gave start to children who suit Catherine's careful plans. When pregnancies passed off outside Catherine's managed pairings, and that they did, due to the fact people will shape attachments and intimate relationships, even inside the most oppressive occasions, Mrs. Grayson furnished abortifacts, plant-primarily based compounds that caused miscarriages. She accomplished these strategies in a small room at the back of the overseer's cottage, far from the principal residence, far from witnesses. The women subjected to those pressured abortions hardly ever said them, even to each different. The trauma turned into profound, the grief unvoicable in a device that already denied them autonomy over their personal, our bodies. But whispers circulated via the quarters anyway. Tales of girls who have been pregnant 1 week and bleeding the subsequent, who have been informed they'd certainly misplaced the babies naturally, although anybody knew Mrs. Grayson had been involved. One woman named Ruth tried to face up to. In the spring of 1851, she became 5 months pregnant, when Catherine observed that the daddy turned into no longer the person Catherine had specified for her, but alternatively a younger subject hand named Samuel, with whom Ruth had formed an authentic attachment. Catherine ordered Mrs. Grayson to terminate the pregnancy right away. Ruth ran. She made it nearly 4 miles into the pine forests, southwest of the plantation, earlier than the overseer's dogs tracked her down. She turned into dragged lower back to Thornhill property, held down by using men even as Mrs. Grayson forcibly administered the abortient compounds. Ruth survived the ordeal bodily, but something fundamental broke inside her. She labored robotically after that, spoke hardly ever, and died 2 years later all through a fever outbreak that swept through the quarters. She became 24 years old. However, Ruth's tragedy became just one among many. By 1856, Catherine's program had produced 7 youngsters of her very own, all of whom had been being raised in a peculiar lineal area. They were legally enslaved. Catherine had registered them as such inside the county information, claiming them as children born to enslaved ladies on the property, which gave her criminal ownership of them. However, in exercise they lived within the predominant residence, wore respectable garments, ate higher meals than the alternative enslaved children, and received informal training from Catherine herself. Young Jonathan, the eldest, turned into 8 years old in 1856. he turned into a severe, quiet toddler who resembled Catherine strongly. The equal green eyes, the equal auburn hair, the equal sharp features. He had no reminiscence of his father, Isaac, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1849. Catherine had found Isaac's presence a trouble as soon as his purpose had been served. The money from his sale helped pay down a number of the estate's closing debts. The younger youngsters knew nothing in their actual parentage. Catherine advised them they have been lucky orphans whom she had taken into her family out of Christian charity. She taught them to read and write, a dangerous illegality in Georgia, in which teaching enslaved humans literacy became prohibited through regulation. However, Catherine became assured no one from the outdoor could ever input her domestic and find out what she was coaching those children. She turned into grooming them, getting ready them for the next segment of her plan. However, that section required persistence. The children needed to reach bodily adulthood earlier than they might be used for breeding. Catherine continued her meticulous record-keeping, monitoring their boom, their health, their temperaments. She stated which kids confirmed physical electricity, which regarded greater shrewd, which had been greater compliant. She turned into making plans pairings decades in advance. Inside the meantime, she endured having youngsters of her very own. 3 extra had been born among 1854 and 1856, sons named William and Henry, and a daughter called Caroline. Each had an exclusive father carefully decided on from a number of the enslaved guys at the property. Catherine's standards were ruthlessly sensible. Bodily health, power, first-rate enamel, exact eyesight, no apparent impairments. She cared not anything for his or her personalities or characters. They had been, in her thoughts, virtually genetic cloth to be utilized. The men themselves had no desire in the be counted. Whilst Catherine summoned them to the principal residence, they got here, understanding that refusal might mean brutal punishment or sale. Some of them understood what became happening, that the youngsters Catherine bore could be their own biological offspring, whilst those kids could be raised to think of Catherine as their benefactors and savior. The mental torture of this example was extreme. They have been pressured to turn out to be fathers to kids they might never well known, never figure, by no means shield. One man named Thomas was summoned to the primary residence in 1855. He was 26 years vintage, married to a girl named Hannah, who lived within the quarters. Hannah was pregnant with their first baby. While Thomas found out that Catherine supposed to apply him for breeding, he tried to refuse. The overseer, a brutal guy named Virgil Kane, had Thomas whipped in front of the assembled enslaved populace, 39 lashes that left his again scarred for existence. Then Catherine had him added to the main house besides. Thomas complied. He had no different choice. However, he by no means spoke to Hannah approximately what befell inside the major residence, and Hannah in no way requested. Some knowledge become too poisonous to voice. By 1856, Thornhill Estate housed a populace that appeared ordinary at the surface, however became virtually structured alongside Catherine's twisted logic. There had been the sphere workers, about 20 adults and their youngsters, who labored the cotton and corn under the overseer's supervision. There have been the house servants, 3 women and 1 elderly guy, who cooked, cleaned and maintained the home space. After which there had been Catherine's unique youngsters, 10 in general with the aid of 1856, ranging in age from 8 years vintage down to infancy. Those youngsters occupied a strange role within the plantation hierarchy. The opposite enslaved humans resented them for his or her privileges, however, additionally pied them for what they represented. All of us in the quarters understood on some level what Catherine became doing. They didn't have language for eugenics or breeding packages. The one's phrases might come later, but they recognized the sample. They saw how Catherine stored certain statistics of the kids, how she measured them periodically, how she noted their development in her locked journal, and they waited with a type of horrified anticipation for what would appear when these children grew up. Due to the fact anybody knew what Catherine meant, she had made it clear in diffused ways in feedback and commands. Those kids had been being raised to supply the next generation of people. They had been equipment in Catherine's lengthy time period plan to create a group of workers that would by no means leave, should never be sold, because they have been genetically sure to her and to Thornhill Estate. It was an abomination disguised as innovation. But in the isolated global of a rural Georgia plantation inside the 1850s, with no outside oversight, and absolute power focused in the fingers of the asset's proprietor, Catherine became capable of pursue her imaginative and prescient without interference. The most effective individual who posed any potential chance changed into lawyer Talbot in Westborough, who dealt with the estate's prison affairs and thus had get admission to statistics that would enhance questions. However, Talbot became a realistic man who valued profitable clients, and via 1856, Thornhill property changed into turning into worthwhile. The cotton yields had been enhancing. The body of workers became developing through Catherine's breeding software at no acquisition cost. Debts were being paid down. Talbot asked no uncomfortable questions because he benefited from Catherine's success. The isolation of the plantation helped hold secrecy. Thornhill Estate changed into 7 MMI from Westborough, related by way of a difficult street that changed into often impassable in wintry weather. Neighbours had been few. The nearest plantation changed into 3 miles away. Catherine not often entertained traffic and discouraged social calls, whilst she did interact with other plantation families, typically at church on Sundays or at occasional gatherings in Westborough. She supplied herself as a proper widow, handling her past-due husband's belongings with Christian virtue and sensible knowledge. No one suspected the systematic horror taking place at the back of the whitewashed brick walls of the main residence and in the quarters past the all-right trees. Or even in the event that they had suspected, could they have cared? This became Georgia in the 1850s, a society built at the brutal exploitation of enslaved labor. Catherine's program was more systematic, extra coldly calculated than most, but it was not essentially distinct in kind from what passed off on hundreds of other plantations throughout the South. That was perhaps the maximum traumatic element of the whole situation. Catherine's breeding software became substantial, but it became also logical in the framework of a society that already dealt with people as assets to be bought, sold, and bred at will. She had honestly taken the underlying logic of slavery and observed it to certainly one of its most horrifying conclusions. However, systems built on such profound injustice contain the seeds in their very own destruction. Trade was coming to Georgia and the complete South, although in 1856, few people should believe how soon or how violently it would arrive. The past-due 1850s delivered increasing tensions to Burke County and all of Georgia. The query of slavery's expansion into new territories ruled countrywide politics. The violence in Kansas Territory, where seasoned slavery and anti-slavery settlers have been actually killing every different, became mentioned in irritating tones on the courthouse in Westborough. The presidential election of 1856, which placed James Buchanan in office, did little to solve the essential conflicts tearing the United States of America apart. Catherine paid little interest to politics. Her awareness remained fixed on Thornhill property and her lengthy time period software. Via 1859, her eldest youngsters had been drawing near adolescence. Jonathan became 11, Eleanor changed into 10, Abigail became 9. They have been nevertheless too younger for the breeding section of Catherine's plan, but she became already making arrangements, already selecting which of the enslaved younger girls could be suitable partners whilst the time came. It was for the duration of this period that Catherine constructed what she known as the Heritage Room in a previously unused segment of the mansion's east wing. She advised the resident servants it would be a storage area for own family statistics and memorabilia. In truth, it became a shrine to her breeding software. The room turned into windowless, lit by oil lamps with partitions lined with cabinets and a huge table within the middle. On the cabinets, Catherine saved her coded journals, 3 leather-bound volumes by 1859, chronicling every beginning, each pairing, every observation, approximately the kid's development. She additionally kept small glass vials, each categorized with a name and a date containing locks of hair from every baby. These samples were arranged in rows organized by way of era and parentage, a bodily archive of her genetic experiments. On the desk, Catherine had drawn intricate own family bushes in ink, showing no longer actual family relationships, however, her deliberate pairings for destiny generations. Strains-related names with notations about expected outcomes. Strong charter, properly enamel, wise, compliant temperament. It gave the look of breeding charts for show dogs or rache horses, besides the names have been human. Abigail paired with Thomas's son, Jacob. Eleanor with Isaac's son, Marcus, who could be born in 1862. Margaret with Samuel's nephew, Peter. Catherine spent hours in this room planning a long time into the destiny, imagining a Thornhill property populated with the aid of 100 or more employees, all descended from her, all genetically and psychologically certain to the land. In her thoughts she turned into growing something modern, a plantation that could in no way face exertion shortages, in no way require highly priced purchases of latest employees, never hazard mass escapes because the enslaved populace would have nowhere else to head. They have been family in the most literal feel. The practical implementation of this vision required Catherine to exert even tighter manage over the plantation's social structures. She started out separating the kids into specific corporations based on their roles in her software. The special children, her own organic offspring, persevered living in or close to the main residence. The alternative enslaved youngsters were kept at a distance, snoozing within the quarters, running in the fields as quickly as they were vintage sufficient. But Catherine needed those different kids too. They had been important for the genetic mixing she expected, so she applied a device of subtle manipulation, imparting small privileges to households who cooperated with their pairings, threatening separation and sale to folks that resisted. The psychological stress was titanic and constant. A lady named Violet, mother of 3, observed herself in a not-possible position. In 1860, Catherine had decided that Violet's eldest daughter, a lady of 14 named Sarah, need to be paired with one of the older disciplined fingers, a person in his 30s named Elijah. Sarah was terrified she changed into nevertheless a child, and Elijah turned into antique enough to be her father. Violet begged Catherine to attend, to offer Sarah greater time. Catherine's reaction turned into cold. "You have got 2 more youthful daughters. Violet, might you opt for I sell them to settle this rely? Or will Sarah do her obligation to this estate and to you?" Sarah changed into paired with Elijah that autumn. She gave beginning to a daughter 9 months later and died from complications of the delivery. She changed into 15 years old. Violet never recovered from the loss. She persevered operating mechanically, talking to no person, and in 1862 she walked into the Savannah River and drowned herself. But tragedies like Sarah and Violet's had been invisible to outdoor observers. Whilst traffic came to Thornhill Estate, which was rare, they saw a well-controlled plantation with neat fields, a massive residence, and a body of workers that appeared effectively fed and housed. The horror was carefully hidden, buried within the quarters, locked within the background room encoded in Catherine's journals. Then came 1860, and the whole thing modified. Abraham Lincoln became elected president. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December. Georgia accompanied in January 1861 with delegates on the secession convention in Milledgeville, balloting 208-289 to go away America and be a part of the Confederate States of the United States. Struggle got here in April with the firing on Citadel Sumter. Initially, many Georgians believed it would be a quick conflict, a few months, possibly 12 months, and the Confederacy would set up its independence. But the warfare dragged on through 1861 into 1862 via 1863. Young men from Burke County marched off to combat in Virginia and Tennessee. Some lower back in coffins. Others didn't return at all. The conflict disrupted Catherine's plans in approaches she hadn't anticipated. The overseer, Virgil Kay, enlisted within the Accomplice Navy in 1861 and turned into killed at Shiloh in April 1862. Locating an alternative turned into difficult. Most in a position-bodied white guys have been away at conflict. Catherine subsequently employed an elderly guy named Silas Kendrick, who became too old for army service. Kendrick was much less brutal than Kane had been, but he became additionally much less effective at keeping discipline and manipulate. The enslaved populace at Thornhill property began to feel the moving strength dynamics. News filtered through the slave networks that linked plantations throughout Georgia. Whispered reviews of Union victories, rumors that Lincoln had issued a proclamation freeing enslaved humans in Accomplice territory, speculation about what could occur if the Yankees got here south. Catherine tightened her manipulate as excellent she should. She constrained the enslaved population to the plantation, forbidding each person from leaving, even to visit loved ones on neighboring residences. She extended rations slightly to reduce the temptation to run away, and she increased her breeding program, pushing a number of the youngsters into pairings earlier than she had at the beginning deliberate. Jonathan, her eldest son, grew to become 15 in December 1862. Catherine decided he turned into geared up. She had selected a younger woman named Rachel, 16 years vintage, the daughter of one of the subject arms. Rachel had no say within the remember. In February 1863, Catherine organized for Jonathan and Rachel to be married. In a ceremony she performed herself in the foremost house, a mockery of a marriage, and not using a legal standing, designed in simple terms to provide a veneer of respectability to the breeding pairing. Jonathan, who were raised in isolation from the alternative enslaved people, and taught to think about Catherine as his benefactors, typical this association without query. He had no knowledge of what had been performed to him, no consciousness that Catherine become his biological mom, no experience of the profound wrongness of the whole scenario. Rachel, traumatized into silence, said nothing. However, others inside the quarters had been looking. They noticed Catherine pairing these special youngsters, the ones she'd raised within the important residence, with the alternative enslaved young human beings. They understood this become the next phase of whatever Catherine were planning these kind of years, and a quiet, determined rage began constructing inside the quarters, a rage that would have nowhere to go until situations ultimately shifted in their shoes. The spring of 1863 brought horrible information to Burke County. Accomplice losses had been mounting. The Union military managed the Mississippi River after the fall of Vicksburg. In July, Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania led to disaster at Gettysburg. Shortages of food, fabric, and simple components made lifestyles an increasing number of hard, even for white plantation families. For the enslaved population, conditions have become harsher still as Catherine rationed the entirety more significantly. But something else was taking place at Thornhill Estate, something Catherine tried desperately to cover from the out-of-doors world. The youngsters she have been breeding and elevating have been turning into aware of their true parentage. It started with Elena, Catherine's second-born daughter, now 14 years antique. She had constantly been the most observant of Catherine's children, the only who asked uncomfortable questions. In May, additionally 1863, whilst assisting Catherine arrange papers in the examen, Eleanor discovered one of the coded journals that Catherine had carelessly left unlocked. Helena had discovered to read from Catherine herself. She became clever, curious, and bored with the restrained studying material to be had within the house. The magazine's cipher intrigued her. She spent 3 weeks running on it in secret, the same way Richard had carried out 16 years earlier, slowly decoding the substitution pattern. What she determined destroyed her understanding of her whole life. The magazine exact her idea. Second planting with rootstock 2. Thomas, age 21. Exceptional physical specimen. Strong lower back. Accurate teeth. Climate heat and humid. Assume harvest in overdue October 1848. Elena read the entry time and again, her fingers shaking. Rootstock 2 Thomas. She knew Thomas. He'd become one of the area hands. Quiet man in his 30s, who by no means made eye contact with everybody. He was her father. Catherine turned into her mom. She turned into now not an orphan raised out of charity. She changed into the maid from Catherine's planned breeding experiment. The results cascaded through Elena's mind. If this changed into authentic for her, it was authentic for Jonathan, for Abigail, for all of the youngsters Catherine had brought into the main residence. They have been Catherine's organic youngsters, conceived with enslaved guys, and that they have been lied to their complete lives. Worse still, the magazine laid out Catherine's plans for their futures. Eleanor read the notations, approximately pairings, approximately predicted offspring, about the introduction of a self-maintaining workforce. She saw her personal name in one of the charts connected via a line to someone called Marcus Isaac's son, to be born 1862. Pairing with Eleanor anticipated 1865. Eleanor felt bodily ill. Catherine supposed to pair her with a boy who hadn't even been born yet, to force her to have youngsters who would be enslaved in this plantation all the time, to turn her into another breeding tool on this nightmare system. She confronted Catherine that night time, her voice shaking with rage and horror. I read your magazine. I realize what you are. I understand what I'm... Catherine's face went still, her eyes bloodless as winter. You should not have done that, Eleanor. You're my mother. Thomas is my father. And you've been planning to breed us like animals. Eleanor ought to slightly force the phrases out. "Sit down, Catherine commanded. "No, sit down. The hazard in Catherine's voice turned into unmistakable. Elena sat, her entire frame trembling. Catherine paced the room, her mind honestly operating via the trouble Elena now represented. Eventually she spoke. "You are shrewd enough to apprehend the placement we are in. So I'll communicate. It seems that, sure, I am your biological mom. Yes, I've been enforcing a systematic software to create a self-maintaining group of workers for this property. And sure, you and the others will take part in that application whilst you come of age." "I won't," Elena stated, but her voice lacked conviction. "You may, due to the fact the opportunity is a ways worse." Catherine leaned forward, her face inches from Elena's. "Right now you stay in this house. You devour appropriate food. You put on decent clothes. You could read and write. What do you observe happens if you refuse to cooperate? I sell you. I promote you to a plantation in Alabama or Mississippi, in which they paintings field hands to loss of life in 5 years, in which ladies are brutalized as a count number of direction, where literacy earns you a whipping or worse. Is that what you need?" Eleanor said nothing, tears streaming down her face. "I idea now not." Catherine straightened. "You'll no longer talk of this in your brothers or sisters. You will no longer talk of it to anybody within the quarters. You'll retain your lifestyles exactly as earlier then. And when the time comes which will fulfill your function on this own family's future, you may achieve this. Do you apprehend?" "Sure," Elena whispered. But Catherine had made important errors. She had revealed the fact without accurately controlling the facts. Elena did speak to others, now not at once, however gradually, cautiously. She instructed Jonathan first, showing him the magazine entries she had memorized. Jonathan's reaction changed into specific, from Elena's. He was so very well conditioned via Catherine, so absolutely remoted from any alternative framework for understanding the arena, that he struggled to peer what was incorrect with Catherine's plan. "She gave us a better lifestyles," Jonathan stated, pressured via Eleanor's anger. "We might have been working in the fields. Alternatively, we are right here. We're assets, Jonathan. We are slaves. Our very own mother enslaved us. She's protecting us. She's keeping us together. If we have been sold, we would be separated, dispatched to different locations. This way, we stay together. We live at Thornhill." Elena found out with horror that Jonathan were too effectively indoctrinated. He couldn't see the cage Catherine had built round all of them. However, Abigail, 13 years vintage and sharp as glass, understood right away when Elena instructed her. And Margaret, at 12, understood too. The more youthful kids have been nonetheless too younger to absolutely draw close it. However, the older ones, they knew now. They knew what they were and what Catherine supposed for them. The knowledge changed the environment in the fundamental house. Catherine felt it. That shift within the air. The manner her youngsters looked at her now. There has been worry, yes, but also something else. Calculation, ready. They had been biding their time, and Catherine knew it. She considered her options. She could promote the older children, take away the trouble, but that would waste years of investment and making plans. She may want to punish them significantly sufficient to interrupt their spirits. However, physical brutality may damage them in ways that would intrude with the breeding application. She wanted them wholesome, able to bearing kids. So Catherine chose a distinctive method. She would exhibit the outcomes of disobedience through someone else. In August 1863, a younger lady named Grace tried to run away from Thornhill Estate. She became 17, pregnant and determined. She had been paired with one of the subject palms against her will, and she or he could not endure the thought of bringing a child into this system. She ran at night, heading east towards the Savannah River, hoping to one way or the other cross into South Carolina, and from there make her way to Union lines. She became stuck within 12 hours. The dogs tracked her to a creek 3 mi from the plantation. She became introduced back, locked in one of the outbuildings, and the following morning, Catherine assembled absolutely everyone, all the enslaved people, including her special kids from the principal house in the backyard, among the quarters and the mansion. Grace became introduced out, her fingers tied. Catherine stood on the porch of the main residence, her face expressionless. This lady tried to abandon her obligations to this property and to all of you. She attempted to break the circle of relatives we have constructed here. The penalty for such betrayal need to be severe. What followed changed into brutal. Grace became whipped publicly. 20 lashes administered by way of the elderly overseer Kendrick, who performed the punishment with grim reluctance. Catherine made all of the children watch, consisting of her very own biological offspring. The message turned into clean. That is what occurs to those who try to depart. But Catherine had miscalculated again. The general public punishment did not terrify the enslaved populace into submission. As an alternative, it clarified something for them. Catherine was willing to use intense violence to preserve her marriage, which meant she became afraid. And if she turned into afraid, that supposed they had greater electricity than they had found out. Whispers started out circulating through the quarters in the weeks that accompanied. Whispers about awaiting the right second. Whispers about what might occur while the battle ended, because truly it would stop, and truly the Yankees would come south and really matters might trade. All they needed to do changed into survive till then. Helena heard those whispers. She began spending time close to the quarters while Catherine wasn't watching, developing relationships with the opposite enslaved people she was saved, cut loose her complete lifestyles. She found out things Catherine had never told her, about her father Thomas, approximately the other men Catherine had used, approximately the women who had died or been damaged through Catherine's program. One nighttime in October, Helena met with a set of the older enslaved ladies inside the woods beyond the quarters. They sat in a circle within the darkness, speak me in low voices. A female named Wish in her 40s checked out Helena with something among pity and admire. "Your mama. She thinks she made something unique right here," Wish stated quietly. "Suppose she made own family." However, all she did turned into make those who hate her in methods she can't even understand. "What happens when the war ends?" Eleanor asked. "Depends on who wins," Hope replied. "Yankees win. We're unfastened. Confederates win. Matters live the identical or worsen. However, both way, your mama cannot hold doing what she'd been doing. Too many humans realize. Too many humans irritated. Something got to interrupt. What if we made it wreck?" Eleanor asked. The girls checked out her in marvel. Desire leaned forward. "What you pronouncing, infant? What if we did not look ahead to the conflict to end? What if we ended this ourselves?" The concept hung within the air, risky and intoxicating. One of the more youthful women, Anna, spoke up. "You speak me approximately strolling, taking everybody and jogging or combating?" Eleanor stated. "There is handiest Mrs. Catherine and antique Mr. Kendrick. There are 40 people and 20 of them are youngsters." Wish stated practically. "And in which are we going to move? Confederates catch runaways. They kill us or promote us in addition south. And also you. You suspect they're going to peer you as one people, or certainly one of them?" The query stung due to the fact Elelana didn't know the answer. She became Catherine's daughter. She had grown up within the most important residence. She ought to study and write. Her pores and skin turned into lighter than most of the people in the quarters. Would they even receive her if things got here to violence? Before Elelana could reply, they heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Everybody scattered, melting into the darkness. Elelana ran lower back in the direction of the primary residence, her coronary heart pounding, questioning if a person had heard their communication, if Catherine might discover if the whole thing changed into about to fall apart. However, no punishment came. Day after today exceeded typically, and the day after that it regarded that they had escaped detection. However, the seed had been planted. The idea that they did not ought to passively await outside forces to unfasten them. They could act themselves. That idea began spreading through the quarters like a fever. Catherine sensed the trade, but couldn't become aware of its supply. She extended her surveillance, had Kendrick patrol the quarters at nighttime, restrained movement even similarly. The anxiety at Thornhill Estate grew thicker with every passing week. It was like looking a storm build at the horizon. Dark clouds massing, electricity charging the air, every body anticipating the lightning to strike. The damage came in March of 1864. However, no longer inside the way absolutely everyone anticipated. A unit of Confederate cavalry got here via Burke County, requisitioning elements from plantations, food, horses, fabric, something beneficial for the battle attempt. Catherine had no desire but to conform. She provided corn, preserved meat, and of the plantation's quality horses. The squaddies stayed simplest one night, camped inside the fields beyond the quarters, and departed at dawn. However, their presence had results. The squaddies spoke openly about the war's development, and the news turned into terrible for the Confederacy. Sherman turned into pushing through Georgia. Union forces were remaining in from multiple instructions. Some squaddies spoke fatalistically about the struggle being misplaced, about going home, about the impossibility of maintaining the fight tons longer. The enslaved population at Thornhill Estate heard each word. Wish surged through the quarters. Freedom changed into coming. It might be months or weeks, however it become coming. All they had to do become keep on a little longer. Except Catherine, sensing this wish and terrified by means of what it supposed for her lengthy time period plans, determined to act decisively. If the Confederacy fell, if the enslaved populace become freed, the entirety she had constructed would fall apart. Her unique kids would leave. Her breeding application would cease. 16 years of labor could be for not anything. She couldn't allow that to take place. On the night time of March 17, 1864, Catherine collected her biological children inside the fundamental house. Jonathan, Eleanina, Abigail, Margaret, Samuel, William, Henry, Caroline, and the 3 youngest who had been nevertheless infants. 11 youngsters in overall, starting from 16 years antique down to 6 months. Matters are going to alternate very quickly, Catherine instructed them, her voice calm, however her eyes severe. The struggle may cease badly for us. The Yankees may additionally come. There can be attempts to take you far from me, to wreck our own family. I can't permit that to appear. Eleanina felt ice slide down her backbone. What are you planning? We are going to comfortable our future, Catherine said. Tonight. She led them to the history room in the East Wing, the room none of them except Jonathan had ever been allowed to enter. Catherine lit the oil lamps illuminating the cabinets of journals, the vials of hair samples, the complicated family bushes drawn on paper and pinned to the walls. This is our legacy, Catherine said. That is what we've built together, and nobody goes to take it from us. From a locked cabinet, Catherine withdrew a small wooden container. Internal were numerous glass bottles containing clear liquid. This is a medicine referred to as laudanum, she explained. In small doses, it affords alleviation from ache. In large doses, it gives eternal peace. Abigail gasped. You need to poison us? I want to guard you, Catherine corrected, her voice taking over a fringe of desperation. If the Yankees come, if they free the others, where will you move? You're now not white enough to live in white society. You are now not completely black in their eyes either. You may be outcasts owned by means of nobody, belonging nowhere. Is that better than staying here, staying together, staying with me? Sure, Eleanor stated firmly. Whatever is higher than this. Catherine's face hardened. You're too young to recognize. All of you are too young. However, I'm your mom, and that I know what's first-rate for this family. She moved in the direction of the bottles, but Jonathan stepped among her and the others. He was 16, almost as tall as Catherine, and something in his face had modified. No, he said quietly. Jonathan, don't be silly. You recognize the plan. You have continually understood. I understood what you advised me, Jonathan stated. However, Eleanor confirmed me the journals. I examined what you wrote about us. Approximately Father Isaac, approximately Father Thomas, approximately all of them. I know what you probably did. I know what you're. I am your mom. You're a monster, Jonathan said, and his voice broke on the word. Catherine slapped him, a pointy crack that echoed in the small room. How dare you? After the entirety I've given you, after the entirety I've sacrificed, you sacrificed not anything, Eleanina stated, stepping forward to stand beside Jonathan. You used human beings. You destroyed them. You destroyed us. Catherine looked at her children, seeing them simply, possibly for the primary time. They had been united against her. Even the more youthful ones who failed to absolutely apprehend what was happening sensed the disagreement and stood with their older siblings. She had misplaced them. In that moment, Catherine made a final determined choice. If she could not maintain her kids, in the event that they were going to reject her and depart her and smash everything she had built, then she could, as a minimum, hold the record of what she had achieved. Future generations would recognize what Catherine Thornhill had created, even if the creation itself had failed. She grabbed the journals, the charts, the vials of hair samples, clutching them to her chest. "You believe you studied, you can get away me. You observed, you can pretend none of this happened. Those information will continue to exist. They will prove what I constructed here. They will prove I was proper." She driven beyond her youngsters and ran from the room, wearing the physical proof of her crimes. Jonathan and Eleanor chased after her, but Catherine became faster, driven by manic electricity. She ran via the main residence out the front door across the yard in the direction of the quarters. What happened subsequent relied on who you requested. Multiple memories might later battle, anyone remembering the event slightly in a different way, shaped by means of their personal trauma and angle. What is positive is that Catherine reached the quarters wearing her journals and specimens. What's certain is that the enslaved population, roused via the commotion, emerged from their cabins to look the mistress who had tormented them for 16 years, going for walks towards them inside the darkness, clutching the proof of her atrocities. What is sure is that someone, maybe Hope, perhaps one of the guys, perhaps numerous humans at once, determined that this became the instant. This changed into while it ended. Catherine Thornhill disappeared that night. Her journals had been found scattered in the mud outdoor the quarters, pages torn and muddy. The vials of hair samples have been smashed. The charts have been burned, and Catherine herself changed into really long past. Jonathan and Eleanor attaining the quartersmins after their mum located chaos. Human beings shouting, running in distinctive directions. The acrid smell of smoke in which a person had lit a hearth to burn Catherine's papers. "However, no, Catherine. Wherein is she?" Jonathan demanded. Wish looked at him with an expression he could not examine. "Gone. It's all you need to realize. She's long gone and he or she ain't coming back." "What did you do to her?" "What she had coming?" Wish stated definitely. "Now you bought a choice, boy. You can improve hell approximately your mama, or you may remember the fact that justice got accomplished right here this night, and permit it relaxation." Jonathan looked at Eleanor. His sister's face was pale, her eyes extensive, but she nodded slowly. "Allow it rest," she whispered. The following morning, Catherine Thornhill became mentioned missing. Antique Mr. Kendrick, the overseer, searched the assets but observed nothing. He pronounced the disappearance to the sheriff in Woosboro, who came out to investigate, but ultimately concluded that Mrs. Thornhill had probably fled the place in fear of advancing Union forces. A reasonable assumption, given the deteriorating Navy situation. Nobody from the quarters said what had passed off. Jonathan and Eleanor and the opposite kids stated not anything. The professional report sincerely states that Catherine Thornhill disappeared on the night of March 17, 1864, and became by no means visible once more. However, each person at Thornhill property knew the reality, even supposing they in no way spoke it aloud. Catherine had been killed that night. Her body had been disposed of someplace on the plantation's 1,700 acres, and her kids, her organic offspring, her breeding experiments, her legacy, had chosen to let her murderers move unpunished because they understood that their mom had earned her fate. The warfare ended 14 months later. Popular Sherman's Navy swept through Georgia in past due 1864, although they handed 30 mi north of Burke County and never got here without delay to Thornhill property. The Confederacy collapsed in April 1865. Freedom came to the enslaved populace of Georgia through a mixture of Navy occupation, the 13th modification, and the simple truth that the system of bondage ought to no longer be maintained. At Thornhill Estate, the transition was complex. Jonathan, as Catherine's eldest toddler, had a few prison declared to the property, but his fame changed into ambiguous, legally enslaved below Georgia regulation, but additionally Catherine's organic inheritor. Legal professional Talbot in Guesborough tried to type out the mess, however in the end gave up. The belongings fell into a form of prison limbo. Maximum of the formerly enslaved populace left Thornhill Estate within weeks of emancipation. They scattered throughout Georgia and past, searching for own family members who had been offered away years earlier than searching out opportunities in towns or truly placing as a lot distance as possible among themselves and the site in their struggling. A few stayed, at least to begin with. Wish remained, supporting to prepare people who had nowhere else to head. Thomas stayed, Eleanor's organic father, who in the end, after 16 years, changed into capable of acknowledge his daughter overtly. They had one verbal exchange about Catherine, about what had been done to him and to Eleanor, and then they by no means stated it again. The pain became too deep, too tangled with the essential wrongness of the entire state of affairs. Eleanor herself stayed at Thornhill property till 1867. She discovered in those years after the battle how to exist as a free character, although the psychological harm of her adolescence in no way fully healed. She sooner or later moved to Savannah, wherein she worked as a seamstress and married a woodworker named William Foster. She never had youngsters. She in no way spoke publicly about her mother or her childhood. While she died in 1903, her obituary made no mention of Thornhill Estate or Burke County. Jonathan stayed at the plantation longer, looking to paintings the land with a small organization of freed guys who remained. But the cotton market turned into depressed, the soil became exhausted, and the property's popularity had all started to spread to the black community in Burke County. By way of 1869, Jonathan gave up and abandoned the estate. He drifted west, finally settling in Texas under an assumed call. He died in 1891, and his few possessions included a small notebook wherein he had written over and over in tiny script, "I did not pick out this. I did no longer pick this. I did no longer choose this." Thornhill property itself decayed rapidly. The primary residence changed into partially burned in a suspicious fire in 1871. The closing structures fell into spoil. The land changed into eventually seized for unpaid taxes and sold at public sale in 1878 to a wooden organization that cleared the antique boom trees and divided the property into parcels. However, in 1871, something changed into determined that delivered the complete tale lower back to public attention, at least in brief. A nicely driller working on a neighboring property accidentally broke through into an antique device on what had been Thornhill land. Within the gadget, 30 FT underneath ground changed into a skeleton. The remains were by and large intact, preserved by means of the cool, dry situations. They belonged to a woman, probably in her 30s or 40s. Scraps of material suggested a dress from the 1860s. A corroded metal locket located near the skeleton contained 2 miniature pics, a man and a young boy. The coroner in Woosboro examined the remains and concluded the girl had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The skeleton changed into buried in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. The reliable document identified the remains only as unknown female, observed former Thornhill property, 1871. However, people in Burke County's black community knew who it was. The tale had been surpassed down in whispers in kitchens and churches, encoded language that included folks that had been present that night, time in March 1864. They knew Catherine Thornhill were killed with the aid of the human beings she had enslaved and brutalized. They knew her frame had been hidden in a deep well or device. They knew justice of a kind had been executed. Over time, more statistics emerged, although always fragmentarily, usually rewritten content incompletely. In 1889, a man on his deathbed in Alabama confessed to a minister that he had helped homicide his former mistress in Georgia at some point of the struggle. He supplied no call, no info. However, the minister stated the confession in his records. In 1902, a girl in Savannah, Hope's granddaughter, wrote a short memoir that mentioned the night the Satan mistress disappeared, and nobody mourned her. The most damning evidence got here to mild in 1923, when a historian discovering Burke County's civil battle records observed a cache of letters in the courthouse basement. Amongst them became a letter written in 1865 with the aid of Union Captain Samuel Reynolds, who had commanded one of the first federal units to enter Burke County after the warfare ended. Reynolds wrote, "We determined demanding evidence at a belongings called Thornhill Estate, symptoms of systematic breeding experiments performed via the late owner upon enslaved persons, including her very own organic offspring. The info are too gruesome to narrate incomplete, but a couple of witnesses showed that the woman, one Catherine Thornhill, had carried out her application to create a self-perpetuating enslaved population through compelled reproduction throughout generations. The witnesses also knowledgeable us that Mrs. Thornhill disappeared in March 1864. And even though they could no longer explicitly country what came about, their meaning became clear enough. I've elected now not to pursue the problem similarly, as it appears to me that whatever justice was enacted upon this girl was well deserved. I have directed my guys to say nothing of what we found out here. The letter turned into filed away and forgotten again, until a graduate scholar discovered it in 1954 whilst researching her dissertation on Reconstruction in Georgia. She attempted to affirm the story, interviewing elderly residents of Burke County who may don't forget circle of relatives stories from that technology. Maximum claimed to recognize not anything. One lady, 93 years vintage, the notable granddaughter of one of the enslaved human beings at Thornhill property, said best, "Some things took place that needed to happen. Some people did things that needed doing, and that is all that wishes to be stated about it." The final thriller of Thornhill estate issues, the 23 kids determined locked inside the basement when federal troops arrived. Captain Reynolds' reputable record mentions them, as do numerous letters written with the aid of soldiers in his unit. The kids were freed and placed with freed guys' households in Burke County and surrounding regions. However, what befell to them after this is misplaced to history. A number of them surely survived to adulthood. A few probable had children of their personal, which means there are in all likelihood people alive today, dwelling in Georgia or someplace else who deliver Catherine Thornhill's genetic legacy without knowing it. They is probably descended from Jonathan or Eleanor or one of the different kids from the breeding software. They might bring a number of the one's special features, pale inexperienced eyes or in hair, sharp cheekbones that marked Catherine's offspring. They might never understand their ancestor, constructed her legacy on one of the most calculated systems of exploitation and cruelty in American history. They might in no way know they exist because a female determined to treat humans as livestock, to construct a dynasty on compelled reproduction and genetic manage. They might by no means recognize that their great first-rate super-grandmother's body lies in an unmarked grave in Burke County, located there by way of the humans she had tormented, humans whose names we can never know because they blanketed each different secrets even in freedom. The website online of Thornhill property today is simply fields and wooded area. The county maintains no ancient marker. No books approximately Burke County records mention the plantation in any detail. The house's foundation is still visible in case you realize where to look, buried below many years of leaf fall and undergrowth. The antique well where Catherine's body changed into hidden has long since collapsed and full of earth. However, the story persists, exceeded down through oral lifestyle in Burke County's black community, whispered in genealogy circles, referenced obliquely in academic papers about slavery and eugenics. It persists as it represents something authentic and terrible about American history, now not simply the brutality of slavery itself, but the methods humans will rationalize and systematize cruelty when they hold absolute energy over others. Catherine Thornhill convinced herself she changed into building something modern, developing a brand new version for plantation management, securing her own family's future. In fact, she turned into perpetuating and intensifying one in all humanity's finest evils. And the human beings she exploited, the humans she bred and managed and tormented, in the end erased her from records as thoroughly as she had attempted to erase their humanity. What do you watched of this story? Do you trust the whole thing was found out? Or are there nevertheless secrets buried on that land in Burke County? The truth is, we may never understand the total volume of what took place at Thornhill property. The people who lived through it, the survivors, chose to hold some secrets to their graves. And maybe it's their right. Maybe some tales belong to the people who endured them, no longer to historians or storytellers like me. But we will honor the ones human beings through remembering that their resistance mattered, that their survival mattered, that they outlasted the gadget designed to smash them. If this tale moved you, if it made you consider the hidden histories to your own community, allow me recognize in the remarks beneath. Share this video with a person who appreciates deep dives into the United States' darkest chapters. Enroll in this channel for more stories that assignment. What you observed you know about records. And do not forget, the past is never as a long way at the back of us as we'd want to believe. See you in the subsequent video.